If I tried to persuade that the p-value was the very most important statistic in the history of statistics, I would not likely achieve consensus among statisticians. This is Data Skeptic Consensus, the 7th installment in our series about how multi-agent systems achieve collective decision-making. The p-value has increasingly come under attack, and often for good reason. But as much as one might want a situation to be binary, the intrinsic goodness or badness of p-values is almost always contextual. Today on the show, I speak with Yudi Pawitan about his paper, Defending the P-Value.
Hi, my name is Yudi Pawitan. I'm professor of biostatistics at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden.
And Yudi, can you tell us a little bit about your specific areas of interest? What are the types of things you generally research?
My research area is primarily bioinformatics. It involves analysis of sequencing data. So you might have heard about the genome sequencing, DNA and RNA sequencing. So there's a lot of statistical problems in there involving, for example, analysis of gene expression. And my particular interest is application in cancer. One typical area is prediction of patient survival, for example, given their genomic characteristics, and also prediction of drug response. So that involves, say, looking at cancer patient. You take the tissue sample, the cancer tissue, and then you try to identify what kind of therapy would be suitable for such patient based on their genomic characteristic.
Gotcha. And obviously we want to do that scientifically, which means we should have good statistical evidence for what we find. There are lots and lots of genes, from what I understand. Is there a problem of bumping into doing too many comparisons or that sort of thing?
That's right. There are different types of problem that's also known, of course, in machine learning, like the supervised and unsupervised learning. In the supervised learning problem, for example, prediction of drug response, the typical input would be, say, the collection of gene expression. So each patient would typically contribute tens of thousands of measurements of genes. Of course, if we simply put all of them together, there's going to be a lot of regularization problem to try to avoid overfitting. The overfitting problem is like the multiplicity problem that you refer to. So that's the kind of problem we face.
So I became aware of some of your thoughts on these matters when I came across your paper, Defending the P-Value, which I certainly want to get into your core thesis, but perhaps before we share some of your thoughts, what is it that we're defending the P-Value from? Who is attacking the P-Value?
Just to appreciate the problem, why p-value is being attacked. So I think we should understand what that is. The p is, of course, for probability, and the p-value is the probability of seeing the observed data or something more extreme than the observed data given a hypothesis. That hypothesis is typically called the null hypothesis. And if we reject such null hypothesis, then we have what's called the alternative hypothesis. So the p-value is a weight of evidence for that null hypothesis. And the procedure to compute it is called significance testing. So let's just give an example. In court, a natural null hypothesis is that the defendant is innocent. So if you reject that, the alternative would be defendant is guilty. In a clinical trial, say a null hypothesis is a drug has no effect. It means it's like a placebo. And if you reject that, the alternative is the drug is effective. And a small p-value is called significant. And that would be evidence against the null hypothesis, right? If it is small. So we say the null hypothesis is false, or in that case, you can claim discovery. And the question is, how small is small? And typical threshold that has been used like 100 years is like 5% in science. But in court, of course, it can be very tiny, like 10 to the minus 10. So p-value has been actually around for more than 100 years. And R.A. Fisher has been kind of named as the culprit in the kind of problem associated with the p-value. You know, he's a scientific giant in statistics and genetics. And he made it very popular, I think, already from about 100 years ago, because he wrote this book called Statistical Methods for Research Workers. If there is a citation to Fisher for every use of the p-value, Fisher will probably have many millions of citations because he practically built statistics from 1920s. So what is the problem? Of course, the problem in recent years is that scientific production is just so many orders of magnitude more than 1920s, when Fisher suggested the p-value of 5% as a threshold to declare significance. So many critics would say that the p-value, particularly the threshold of 5%, would just lead to too many false discoveries, too many false positives. What it means is that you have non-reproducible results. So my key response to these criticisms that they are really misplaced, they are blaming the p-value for the inherently provisional nature of science. So it seems that they cannot see the, to some extent, chaotic process, trial and error in science. It seems that it's almost they presume that by banning the p-value, it makes the process of science cleaner and less error prone. But I don't think that is going to happen at all. Science by its nature is always going to be a little bit chaotic. So why do we have this process in science that is kind of somewhat chaotic? When you think of many scientific results, particularly in medicine, are statistical. The results have uncertainties because of limited information, maybe because limited data. And of course, all these issues will disappear if we have certainty or near certainty. Perhaps in physics, we can have much stronger results or experiments compared to in medicine, say. So scientific statements that can be put in terms of statistical hypotheses, scientists will always be aware of the uncertainty because they will manifest in terms of errors, right? Potential errors. We call them type 1 and type 2 errors in statistics. So the type 1 error is simply the false positive, where we claim a discovery, for example, a drug is effective when in fact it is not. So that's the type 1 error. The type 2 error is false negative. That means we are missing a discovery. We say there's no discovery when in fact there is actually something in reality. Any declaration that you make is associated with an error, and there is a kind of a trade-off in the error rates between these two types of error. So if you want to avoid type 1 error, like what a lot of these critics of p-values say, then your chance of making the type 2 error is going to increase. If you're going to make it difficult to declare discovery, then of course you're more likely to commit the false negative error. When you think of statistical methods, they are mostly developed to try to balance between these two errors, at least make them explicit, and then make the balancing process rigorous. And also, as a statistician or a scientist, the method is supposed to make you aware of the relative errors or trade-off between these two. Also, important is to codify, to formalize the process of reporting results, so people understand the level of errors or uncertainty when you are reporting. So the purpose of, for example, reporting the p-value level is then you are actually informing the reader the level of uncertainty in the result. And I think the problem that is really, difficult to understand in a way why there's so much criticism is that the balance between the false positive and the false negative is very context specific. Different areas of science and even different stages of investigation going to have different cost for the errors.
I was going to comment that I was involved in a project where we helped decide what color to use on a website using these same statistical methods. And we tried to do them rigorously, but we weren't as concerned as maybe doing a vaccine test. The same statistics, different problem.
So I think in some areas, we're quite happy to make errors. In fact, scientists making errors for scientists is no big deal at all. Because if they never make errors, they probably don't find anything at all. Through discoveries, without going through process, just kind of error prone, it's going to make it harder to find a true discovery if you're so afraid of false discoveries. So there are some areas which are very clear. Just to pick a colorful example, we have an activity. It's called gold mining. So if you think of gold mining, say the average content of gold, if you just go out and dig out some rocks, you're going to get about 4 in a billion, 4 parts per billion. So that means you get 4 grams for every 1,000 tons of rock. So that's not very productive. But you have a very good gold mine, you get 4 grams per ton. That's 1,000 times better. But 4 grams per ton, that's not very much. And it is still economic to have a gold mine where you have 1 gram in a ton of rock. Why is that? Because, 1 gram of gold today is about $60. 1 kilo is about $60,000. Okay, I know that well. If you order a ton of rock, for example, you need it for your garden or your driveway, how much would you pay?
Well, much, much less than gold, I'll tell you that.
But just make a guess.
Boy, for a ton, I don't know, maybe $1,000?
Oh, no, you're way off.
What would it be?
It's probably in the order of $10 to $25.
Oh, despite the weight, it's just so common.
Yeah, and it's delivered to your driveway.
That sounds like a bargain.
Yeah, exactly. That means $60 per gram is worth it, right? Because the cost of moving the rock is probably in the order of $10. It's still a lot of profit to be made. So what it means is that if your false positive is cheap and the true positive is valuable, you should never be worried about false positives. Also, something that we should always remember, this is really strange that statisticians forget about it because we teach this to our students all the time, that we should always think about the relative cost of type 1 and type 2 errors. They are not the same, right? So George Soros, everyone knows George Soros, right? The famous investor.
Yep.
He also considers himself like a philosopher, and he has a lot of very wise quotes. And one of the famous quotes from George Soros: it's not whether you are right or you're wrong that's important. It's how much money you lose when you're wrong and how much money you make when you're right. It's really just balancing the relative cost of being right and being wrong. But we can easily extend, right? That it's not how often you're wrong or how seldom you're right that's important. What matters is whether you're right eventually. So in the process of being right, you can go through enormous number of wrong things. But if you can afford that, the wrong things are, for example, your job, or the wrong things are easy to deal with, then it doesn't matter, right? So I think that's kind of my point, that in so many areas of sciences, this cost of type 1 and type 2 errors are so different. So there are some areas of science, for example, epigenetics. I wonder, are you familiar with that?
I know the basics of it, but that's about as far as I go. Let me appeal to the engineers and the data scientists today when I tell you about our sponsor, Monday.com. Engineers are very familiar with ticketing systems and basic tools like that for managing the development of software. Raise your hands. How many of you like the tools that your company has asked you to use? 9 out of 10 of you are shaking your head no. And even that rare satisfied individual should still check out Monday.com. It is the type of collaboration and planning platform that everyone in an organization, regardless of role and department, can like. It's almost a guarantee that your team has gotten a little bit more remote, maybe 100% remote. So having a platform that's flexible and transparent and allows for communication and collaboration on your workflows and projects is more critical than ever. If your team slips into chaos, it's hard to recover. When your teamwork is effective, nothing can stop you. Now, for data scientists on the team especially, your work is not like a software engineer's. We can't as elegantly spell out exactly the steps you're going to do in your process because it's going to change as you explore and analyze. You need something more adaptive and flexible, and Monday.com is the right tool for you. You can start a free 14-day trial at Monday.com. Hey, that's a whole sprint. If you want to check out this generous offer, head over to Monday.com.
Right. So everyone knows that, we inherit characteristics from our parents through the DNA, which is a molecule. So it is quite stable molecule. It has some mutations, but it's really very, very tiny, like 10 to the minus 8 rate. So I want to describe a kind of a scientific phenomenon that is so valuable to know, right? Just to indicate, it's a bit like gold. In the process of trying to discover epigenetic inheritance, you may have to deal with a lot of rock. The standard inheritance is DNA based, but with epigenetics, it is not coded in the DNA, but it's like some molecule that is attached to the DNA. So normally these molecules get removed during the processing of the germline in the body. But there are some evidence that some of these epigenetic marks, that means they are not DNA, are actually passed to the next generation. So for example, if your grandmother or grandparents experience starvation, then at your generation, you may have some impact. Something like that is actually biologically quite amazing, but extremely difficult to establish. And any scientist working in that area is going to suffer enormous number of false positives. They will not be afraid of false positives. Any kind of clue they will pursue. So that's one example. So another area that's kind of opposite, like in recent work in genetics, is something called genome-wide association studies. Have you heard that?
I have, yes.
So in genome-wide association studies, you may investigate genetic factors, right? For example, response to a drug, like for breast cancer, for example. In that process, you're going to measure like 1 million genetic variants. So the potential discoveries are really, really abundant. You're going to get thousands of potential discoveries. And any one of them that requires special investigation to validate, which is extremely tedious, extremely demanding. So you're going to have to be very stringent to go forward. Which one would you want to go forward? You can't just easily dismiss a potential discovery. So a false positive there would be more expensive. So you don't want to allow too many false positives in that case. But on the other hand, you can also have kind of the luxury of getting rid of potential discoveries because it's so abundant. So I think those are some examples that I've given in the paper to highlight the fact that p-value is not the problem. In fact, we need it simply just as some kind of idea of signal to noise ratio, because without that, then we have no chance at all of knowing where to go.
Surely we must have something. Could there be something better than a p-value plus plus, so to speak?
There are actually many variation of p-value. P-value is a kind of universal scale, but depending on the problem, for example, if you're dealing with big data, right? I think it's probably a lot of the data scientists working with big data these days. In the old days, in statistics, we have something called data dredging. So it's kind of a bad idea to look around a large database looking for significance, because what happens in that situation is that you are actually kind of optimizing the p-value. So you're looking around for significant p-value, for small numbers. But once you do that, the number that you're going to see is no longer unbiased, right? It's going to be biased to be small. So you are actually increasing the chance of making false positive, but it's not reflected by the p-value. So you may still say p-value is say 1%, but in fact it could be 10% in terms of the real error rate. But that's kind of in a way that is familiar to people who are working with machine learning, right? When you have a large data set, like in a big data, and then you start building up your model, your chance of overfitting is enormous. So overfitting is like having a small p-value just based on some kind of going around looking for significant result. On the other hand, in machine learning literature, you're not so obsessed about overfitting in the sense that we should never do this kind of feature selection because you're going to have overfitting. You never do that. It's because you know that whatever you do in the training set, there is a potential for overfitting. So you always have a validation set. You always have a test set to make a proper kind of unbiased assessment of error rate. So in a way, the p-value is the same. There's really no need to obsess about p-value being bad or is the wrong thing to do. What matters is that when you think you discover something, you should validate it kind of rigorously. So I don't think there is any need to try to come up with a better p-value or anything like that. I think that the need is really a scientific attitude, which it means is that you need to be always skeptical. Whatever you say is kind of provisional. That's what I mean by scientific attitude. But on the other hand, we cannot be arbitrary, because some of the commentators or the critics about the p-value say, okay, you drop it But then they don't offer anything at all. They say, okay, you just report, for example, your mean, your sample mean or standard deviation, and you don't do anything, for example, comparison. Then you don't make any judgment about the differences, whether it is like a real difference or it is potentially just due some chance. I think that's actually defeats the purpose of the scientific process.
Yeah, I'm puzzled by that as well. I struggle to understand the motivation to simply remove them. I guess if it adds clarity, which you could argue, how does taking something away add clarity? I guess it can in some cases, but for the most part, it seems like you're just giving less information. Do you have a sense of how readers read p-values?
I suppose this is where the problem could be, right? That if the reader is very scientifically minded, then they just take p-value and then they say, okay, you get some indication of significant result. Maybe you have something there, and let's see whether you get a really rigorous validation of the result. But unfortunately, not everyone would see results that way. If we want to look at the criticism in the most positive way, is that they really want to avoid the people who take p-value in the most naive way. They want to avoid them to be so confused about the results. And I think in this case, I also sense that they are so concerned about the public being confused. For example, nutrition epidemiology is kind of notorious, right? For example, you have coffee. Oh, you are from LA, right? So at some point, wasn't there a judge telling the coffee shops to put some kind of warning that coffee can cause cancer?
Right. Yeah, we have this in California where I live.
Yeah, right, exactly. But they have removed that, right?
I haven't been to a coffee shop in some time now, so I'm not sure. But you may be right, yeah.
Right. So actually, they have removed that, I think, from maybe either last year or the year before. But anyway, that's typical in kind of nutritional epidemiology. So many kinds of nutrients. They say, okay, this is good for you. For example, even egg. At some point, NIH would say, okay, too many eggs, give you high cholesterol. And then later on say, okay, no, egg is okay. That kind of result, of course, very confusing for the public, kind of bad idea. So in a way, the problem is that the public and the scientists have different cost structures, right? So false positive for the public, in some sense, is more costly. They get confused and they think that all science is just so confusing, particularly nutrition epidemiology. But for scientists, being wrong is really no big deal at all. We just say, okay, well, maybe this is not right because of this and because of that. But there is, at some point, you're going to get some kind of underlying truth. But the public will never see the whole thing as a kind of a continuous process. So that aspect about the differences on how the public view results from science and the way the scientists view the results of science, I think that's a difficult issue.
I don't know if everyone who hasn't read your paper yet would fully appreciate all the places the p-value shows up. If, let's say, tomorrow some sort of law was passed banning the p-value, we wouldn't just lose the p-value, we'd lose some other things, would we not?
Yeah, absolutely. So I made a list of areas in statistics where it will be extremely awkward not to have the p-value. So just put it maybe in last, but definitely not least, is that the p-value is part of a collection of methodology associated with the designs of experiments. So the concept of type 1 and type 2 errors, power or sensitivity of an experiment, sample size, like when you're going to start a clinical trial, or even like doing the COVID vaccines, for example, the phase 3 vaccines, people talk about, oh, you need at least 30,000 people to do this clinical trial. How do they get 30,000? It's all based on some kind of balancing between the type 1 and the type 2 error. And without that consideration, then all this kind of rigor that we need for performing experiments, as particularly medical experiments, will not be possible. So p-value is part of all that. And I have never seen any kind of discussion by the critics of the p-value. How do you deal with all the other things associated with testing?
Yeah, let's get rid of the government and taxes and the economy all at once, too.
Yeah.
Well, I know there are many journals that have taken some broad and some weak stances on this, even I think maybe one that's outright banned p-value reporting altogether. You've spent a lot of time thinking about this. If you were giving advice to a journal, what do you think they should do, if anything, when developing an editorial policy around this topic?
So a journal, that means in a research area. So you have a sense in that research area whether, in terms of the relative cost of the type 1 and the type 2 errors, and also the relative abundance of potential discoveries. So if you are in a research area like genetics today, is kind of in a luxury position where potential discoveries is just absolutely too much, then they have the luxury to put a very, very strict p-value, like 10 to the minus 8. But if you are in another research area where potential discovery is really so minuscule, for example, I was describing to you like epigenetic inheritance, then it doesn't make sense in that case to be so strict. You should allow all possible leads. Even at the p-value, it's much larger threshold. So it really depends on the research area.
Gotcha, yeah, because everyone's research area has more or less noise. I would assume the physicists these days have got it down to very few variables, but sociologists, on the other hand, the amount of confounding factors seem to have a huge impact on their statistics. Is that part of the core of why it's challenging?
Yeah, that's why to have some kind of blanket rule is really hard in that sense, yeah.
And I'm curious if you have thoughts on methodologies like the Bonferroni correction or false discovery rates, things meant to kind of assign or tweak the p-value, especially for large inferences.
That's right. Actually, I've worked quite a lot on false discovery rate methods. So it is definitely an improvement in terms of the assessment of false positive rate. So the best kind of assessment is probably what's called the flexible post hoc false discovery method. So this method would allow you to look at the result, for example, in the top 5 best result or the top 10 best result, and then it will make an assessment among those top 5, how many do you have high confidence to be true discoveries, for example. So if you have multiple testing for the kind of methodology that is most flexible for practical statistics, yeah.
And I guess returning to the thesis of the paper, defending the p-value, we've covered a lot of areas of where it's still important in different aspects of science and understanding. And I guess you've highlighted as well that it's not the p-value alone, but, the cost of the false positives and false negatives from the, perspective of the general public and communicating to them. How can scientific writing be effective, and how can people convey truth, which is sort of the ultimate goal?
The best thing to achieve is to get the public to develop a scientific attitude, but we know that this is very hard. Not only the public have different cost structure of the errors compared to the scientists, the public might also have different kind of skepticism. The scientific skepticism is a healthy skepticism. It's a necessary ingredient in our search for truth, in our error-prone scientific process. But the public skepticism could be just a political position, nothing to do with interest or search for truth. So take, for example, the climate change. The scientists might have some skepticism. Yes, the global temperature is rising, but how much of that is due to human activities like the burning of fossil fuels? And how much of that is due to natural long-term variation, perhaps due to orbital changes, for example? In geologic timescale of tens of thousands of years, we have cycles of global cooling and global warming. Your skepticism is needed to keep your brain open to possibilities, but public skepticism might just mean a denial. For example, you deny the possibility of climate change, and you are a climate change skeptic. So your skeptical attitude is a position, is not part of the process of finding the truth.
Yeah, I would agree. It's definitely a challenging issue. These are hard problems, and we're going to need techniques like these to solve them. I think statistics is the only language to sort out the answers for us. So I am glad to have read your treatise, Defending the P-Value. Well, then to wrap up, Yudi, where can people follow you online?
So I just have my website.
I'll put your website in the show notes so people can find the paper, which is also an archive, and read up on some of your other work that way. Yudi, thank you so much for joining us today. That concludes this installment of Data Skeptic Consensus. Our guest today was Yudi Pawitan. Our theme song is Paradox by Odling. Claudia Armbruster is our associate producer. Vanessa Burciaga does guest coordination. And I've been your host, Kyle Polich.